So hi, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. And want to welcome you to our webinar, Activist Exchange Notes from Black Liberation and Hong Kong. My name is Vincent Wong, and I'm a member of the Lausan Collective. I'll be your moderator for today. And I'm just really excited to be part of this important and timely exchange between Hong Kong activists and US-based Black activists. And we have a wonderful and exciting slate of organizers and activists with us today. And before delving into the substance of the panel, I'd like to take care of a few housekeeping items. So the first is that this is a public venue, so we encourage folks to take necessary security and privacy steps while attending this event. There is, of course, a risk of surveillance on activists involved in resistance movements, whether they be from the Chinese authorities or the US authorities. It's interesting to be saying that on the same venue, but be cognizant of the risk and in terms of being too specific on particular things. In specific, there's a set of national security laws coming up in Hong Kong, so please take the necessary security and privacy precautions that you need to do. There are questions about why we're using Zoom for this, particularly given recent political censorship. And the reasons for this are manifold. One is that given the number of expended attendees and the necessity of live Cantonese language interpretation, some of those features can only be offered on Zoom. And so for this particular event, we're using Zoom, but in the future, we're really going to aim to move away from the use of Zoom in future events. So please bear with us for that. One important housekeeping item is if you do not need the Cantonese live interpretation, that's only possible on Zoom. We ask that you prioritize those who might need it and log off Zoom and log on to our Facebook live streaming link instead, which will be shared by our Lausan volunteers. In terms of Cantonese interpretation, we have a set of volunteers from Lausan helping with live interpretation and the back-end logistics. So a reminder for the speakers that because of the live interpretation, please try not to speak too quickly and give some pause between ideas so that our interpreters can keep up. And lastly, a couple of community guidelines. This is a safe space for collaboration, learning, critique upon an ethic of care, solidarity, and good faith as we work together towards emancipatory futures. And so in that vein, we reject all ideologies of dehumanization, including sexism, racism, nativism, classism, transphobia, homophobia, ableism, and ageism. We try to aim to resolve conflicts by searching for constructive solutions. But if anybody is being persistently harmful or disruptive, they may be potentially removed from this particular webinar. These are difficult conversations, so please be mindful not to sensationalize trauma, particularly Black trauma, and try to assume that everybody's input here today is in good faith and in a respectful manner. So before I introduce our amazing panelists today, I want to give a little bit of backdrop in terms of what brings us here today. George Floyd's murder in May at the hands of Minneapolis police, following high-profile police shootings, including of 26-year-old Breonna Taylor in her own home in Kentucky, the lynching of Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia has sparked a global reaction in terms of the protest movement for Black liberation and to resist racist anti-Black police violence in the US. Here in Canada, I'm speaking from the Greater Toronto area. We had a 26-year-old DeAndre Campbell with mental health issues shot dead by police in his home, and Regis Korchinski Paquette, a Black Indigenous woman who, according to her mother, was pushed off her apartment balcony by police and died from the fall. So the movement for Black lives, for Black liberation, is shaking the political landscape of the US and beyond, and really completely changing the public's imagination of the function of police and what safety and security really means. Meanwhile, in Hong Kong, pro-democracy protesters have been engaged in a titanic struggle against police brutality and the imposition of a police state in a continuing protest that has now exceeded 1 year in duration. Their aspirations for universal suffrage, for amnesty of political protesters, and accountability for police violence has been met instead with massive state violence and persecution. It's estimated that up to 88% of the Hong Kong population of 7.4 million have been exposed to tear gas, 88%. The Chinese government has recently really tightened its hold on the people of Hong Kong, sparking a new wave of protests with the introduction of national security laws. And our friends from the US may not have heard of this particular case, but in early May, a South Asian man was killed by Hong Kong police, one officer of whom violently pinned his back and neck down with his knee in a method of excessive force that was similar to that used against George Floyd by Minneapolis police officers. The man died of his injuries a day later. His identity still has not been released, and the police still claim no wrongdoing. The worldwide mobilization against state violence has seen the rise of new movement strategies and street tactics. So the focus of our webinar, among other things, is how can we envision a global mass movement against state violence on the ground? How can transnational social movements, which have such different contexts and histories, talk to one another and learn from one another in a way that is respectful and productive, and that does not diminish or co-opt other movements? And it's within this context that we are really thrilled and privileged to have these amazing activists from Hong Kong, Seattle, and North Carolina for an organizers exchange to chat about their work within social movements, the role of unions and labor organizing, police and prison abolitionism, among other topics. Organizers will have a space to share grassroots strategies and resources on building mass movements against state repression and for more emancipatory futures for their communities. Hong Kongers will also have the opportunity to learn directly from on-the-ground organizers within the Black liberation movement, beyond what is heard or read in the news media, and hopefully challenging some preconceived notions that folks might have for what it looks like to be Black in white settler colonial nations that are built on the institution of Black slavery, like in the United States, and how we can do better as Hong Kongers and the diaspora to combat anti-Black racism within our own communities. And so with that, today, I would love to introduce to you our four amazing panelists. We have Jarrell Davis from Decriminalize Seattle and No New Youth Jails. We have Leo Tang, Organizing Secretary of the Hong Kong Confederation of Trade Unions. We have Maya Little, who is part of Take Action Chapel Hill. And finally, we have Tony Wong, an editor for The Owl, a leftist publication in Hong Kong. So each speaker will have about 7 to 10 minutes to introduce themselves and their work and share with us their thoughts and observations. And after that, we'll open it up to the audience for a moderated Q&A session. So Jarrell, if it's okay, hopefully we can kick it off with you. So take it away.
Sounds good. Can everybody hear me? Peace. Good morning, y'all. It's about 7 a.m.-ish in Seattle, northwest of the United States, Turtle Island. We're in Coast Salish, occupied Coast Salish indigenous land. I just want to acknowledge that. I'm born and raised in a neighborhood called South Seattle, Rainier Beach in Seattle. I just want to contextualize Seattle in the grand scheme of the United States is also its own culture, its own pocket, especially when it comes to being someone of African descent that's grown up in Seattle on a national scale. And so I just want to make sure that I acknowledge and leave space for all the Black folk from the South, all the Black folk from the East Coast, knowing that Seattle's experience it can't be generalized. The Black people in the United States are not a monolith. And my experience just represents one particular branch of the historical Black experience. I'm honored to be on this call with folks from Hong Kong, with Maya and North Carolina. Appreciating being here. My organizing centers around education and young folk. I really think it's important that we create safe spaces for young people to not just be politicized, but to self-identify and learn themselves. So that self-knowledge is really the centripetal force of building global solidarity, especially when we're talking about living in a place that has so many intersectional identities. When you can be a Black woman of African descent in a classist state under a system of patriarchy, it's so many different intersections that need to be navigated. And so a lot of my work centers around the building element. There's definitely elements of dismantling. And I think that that's one of the philosophies I try to operate with. And I'm gonna slow down because I wanna make sure that the translator is able to hear me. But building and dismantling are two branches of organizing I think that are very important, especially when it comes to police violence, state-sanctioned violence, and building a global transnational movement. The dismantling is very important when it comes to disrupting, interrupting, defunding, abolishing systems that are harming us. And the building element is important because when those systems no longer exist, we need the alternative, not the alternative, we need an institution to support each other. And so I think of things like community care. If we get rid of the healthcare system, we still need to find a way to make sure that our young people, that our elders, that our folks that have compromised immune systems are able to be healed. And we have our own indigenous and cultural practices that could be implemented in there. I think about the same thing when it comes to community defense. We want to get rid of the police. And at the same time, we also want to keep our families safe. And we know that police have never actually kept us safe, but in fact, exacerbate our discomfort in our neighborhoods. And so really appreciative to be able to build and learn with a lot of young people based out of Seattle. I feel that a lot of the organizing is predominantly led by women and women of color, trans folk of color. And I follow that leadership often and build with an intersectional community. And I believe that that's definitely an important element of a transnational movement is how do we navigate specific intersections and whether we're talking about anti-Blackness in the Asian community, whether we're talking about colorism in the Latinx community, whether we're talking about patriarchy within the Black American experience. These are all intersections that, depending on how we engage them, will sustain our organizing. And I'm someone that also is interested in restorative justice, transformative justice, as well as navigating, conflict myself, falling forward often and learning from our mistakes, how we engage each other when conflict arises, because That's very important for sustaining a movement. As a member of the African diaspora, I just really think about Black liberation on a global scale. I don't think about it as reforming. I don't think about it as trying to get a little piece of Turtle Island, but I think it's very important for global unification of folks of African descent, which is also a very big topic to discuss because Africa is a continent and Black folks have been all around the world, for hundreds of years now. And so appreciative to be on this call, looking forward to learning, sharing ideas, and being challenged as well. Thank y'all. We'll be free.
Thank you so the principles of both. Sorry, am I? Okay, I'm sorry, I'm unmuted now. Okay, cool. Thank you so much, Jarrell, for your insights and just like flagging that principle of dismantling has to also go with building, right? That abolition politics is not just negative, but it's also figuring out creative ways, systems and solutions that really help our communities and neighborhoods that is outside of the police and the structure that it maintains. I want to turn it over now, and I just want to acknowledge the difficulties of our interpreters in trying to translate these pretty tough concepts from English to Cantonese. So appreciate your work there. So next I wanted to turn it over to Leo Tang, organizing secretary for the Hong Kong Confederation of Trade Unions. Leo, take it away.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me to the discussion. And so maybe today, with the backdrop of the Beijing imposing the national security law to Hong Kong, is a great time, and 1 year of the Hong Kong protests is a great time to have a sharing with you. I think today I can make a short presentation, more focused on the local institution building throughout the movement, which is we never expect last year. Can I share the slides? Let me, yeah. Is it okay? Yeah. So I think one of the remarkable things that throughout the years of the Hong Kong protests that I would like to tell is the very important move that is year of street protest. The energy has become into institutional building like organizations. Yeah. So I think while we're talking about the national security law, it's very important for us to know the background. Yeah. For me, I try to argue the national security law, which imposed by the Beijing government directly to Hong Kong right now, and the 28th of May, is actually a total response to the Hong Kong protests. Many people analyze this as using the perspective of international clash between the Western countries and China. That's one perspective, but I'd like to tell that is also a total response to Hong Kong protests, which the Hong Kong protest is no longer just a protest on the street, but is getting more and more organized and creating, shaping the new civil society in Hong Kong as a new collective. And the national security law is actually a total response to this. Yeah. So there is a free move. Is very remarkable throughout the movement. Getting touched by the militant protester on the streets, many Hongkongers are looking for way out for how to sustain the Hong Kong movement. So the movement of the anti-extradition bill has become the movement to anti the totalitarian governance from the Beijing. So now we have the so-called yellow economic circle, which is promoting a value that's a protester or pro-democratic, pro-movement Hong Kong citizens should spend their money on our own circle instead of paying this to the pro-Beijing businessmen. We also have the pro-democratic camp has win the majority in the district council in last year and the November as well. So here is a district councillor cross district meeting, which has never happened before. Yeah, this is two important move that it shows that the energy from the street protest has become more institutionalized. And the first thing I would like to address more is the rise of the labor subjectivity. Later on become the new union movement. I try to make it quick. Yeah. Yeah. So now we have in Hong Kong there are more than 50 new unions established, and the initiative could be traced back to July. Yeah, because there were a call for there were several calls for general strike throughout the movement, but the most remarkable one happened on the 5th of August, and there were the people started to organize so-called telegram unions in order to call people to go on strike on the 5th of August. And in the mid of July, there were many groups in Telegram formed based on the industrial relations. So artists, workers in the art industry, designers, financial workers, social workers. So all of these industry, they have their own very big discussion room in the Telegram channel. So they have their own circle, started to organize in a way is based on their industrial identity. Yeah, so before this move, the Hong Kong protest, no matter it's 1 million or 2 million, is always based on one identity, Hong Kongers. But since this move happened, their identity become more specific. It could be like where do you work? Which company do you work? There is even Telegram groups based on H&M company. Yeah. So on the 5th of August, there were self-mobilized strike that we call where 350,000 of workers went on strike in the 7th district. Yeah, and we have a so-called longest picket line in the strike, which the people stuck our railway. Yeah. So what I call the labor subjectivity in the movement, that means people started to struggle and using their own professions as a way to struggle. This has, in the political movement in Hong Kong, is very seldom happen like this. And before the 5th of August strike, there were a remarkable assembly organized by civil servants and medical workers. And these two assembly basically shows that even civil servants can stand up in a totalitarian regime, and it's somehow mobilize people to go on strike on the 5th. And then on the 5th of August, apart from the 7th District Assembly, there is an Art Workers Assembly, particularly for workers who work as an artist, designer, or theater workers, which is this free assembly has become the very remarkable one, because Hongkongers started to use their own industrial identity for their call for the 5 demands. And later on, these organizers started to think further to organize labor union. Then that's something I will tell. Yeah. So the new union wave actually from the Telegram channel, Telegram Union to Real Union is basically from July to September. When I prepared this sharing, I recorded that the first group of young people who come to our CTU office to discuss whether to form a union, it was 14th of August. And there was a group of bank worker. They want to form finance union, financial industry employee unions. So now, yeah, that's where the first one. And then at the same stage, at the first stage, these 5 unions established. And somehow these workers were unorganized in the traditional labor union in Hong Kong. And it shows that using the political initiative is even more attractive for them to form a union. And forming a union become one of the way out for them to imagine how to win the battle. Yeah. So in the beginning, how important of this move is that in the beginning, the movement, the mobilization, the way of mobilization are all anonymous, and there is no centralized leaders, and people believe that that is even more effective to fight against the government, and that's true in a way, yeah. But at this stage, people started to think if they want to fight further, they somehow need organizations. Yeah. So after these 5 union established, there's already for this union for new civil servants. Actually, the founders are the organizer of this civil servants assembly on the 2nd of August. Yeah. And then later on, people throughout the movement, and then a lot of battle on the street, people started to think why there is no successful general strike. And then people, some of the Telegram channel call for organized union and then go on strike. This channel is a new one. I think they established on the October, and then they catch the momentum that many of the peaceful protesters would think, what can they do further? And then that's where the new union wave came, is in the November. So you can see there is a wide industrial organizing. So including marketing workers, theater workers. So here, the theater workers, the founder of this theater arts union is actually also organized the 2nd of August Art Worker Assembly. So there's a strong relation between the street protests and the establishment of such unions. Yeah. So also at this stage, during the November, the Hospital Authority Employees Alliance have established, which is a new hospital unions. They organized the first and the largest medic strike in in February during the pandemic. So, here we can see a tendency that the street protests, which happen every week, has become an energy for people to think further, and then they try to organize union as a way out. Yeah, and then in the imagination, a successful general strike will be the last resort to fight against the tyranny. So, and they are trying very hard to move to this stage. Yeah. So this move, as Hong Kong City U, we also find it very interesting because before this movement, like in the umbrella movement, although there are many professions who form professional groups to continue their fight after umbrella movement, but this is the first time there is a new union wave that happened in Hong Kong after the 70s. Yeah. And people spread the skills how to organize in your workplace, and then organize the strike. Yeah. Yeah. So, so here I would like to make a point that is the national security law is actually a total response, in the sense that the Chinese government realized that this energy has become more organized, and which, if they don't have a crackdown, it can last long. Yeah, including the yellow economic circle, including the new union wave, which when the people join into the union as a leader of union, what is happening at the same time is their friends or their comrades in the protests are in the jail. So it creates a strong collective between the businessmen, the yellow economic circle, and the union wave. Yeah, and at the same time, the new union wave also shake the concern of the whole political movement as well, because for example, the medic strike on February, yeah, is basically a political strike because it's call for the government to close the border in order to save the Hongkongers from the pandemic. But at the same time, they also have the demands against the employers to ask for further protection for the nurse, for the doctors in the hospital. So here we can see a model of mixing labor rights and political rights together. And here you can see the union wave is
Leo,
actually
just giving you a time notice, yeah, to wrap it up soon. Yeah, thank you.
I'll start in 1 minute, sorry. Yeah, so it's shaping the movement in a way that is not only political concern, but it's also concerning the people's life in the daily basis. Yeah. So maybe I'll stop here and listen to the other and have some discussion. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Leo. And your points, your presentation was so powerful, and thinking about ways that a movement can be sustained and how economics has such a huge part in that actual labor organizing and the ties between labor organizing and reshaping of civil society as part of a long-term
體體嘅運動係一個非常重要嘅重要一點。
So now I'll turn it over to Maya.
我就俾 Maya 講啊。
Promise, I'm actually hearing your Cantonese translation coming through as well. But I'll turn it over to Maya Little of Take Action Chapel Hill. Maya, take it away.
Hello, can you all hear me? Yeah, cool, awesome. My name's Maya Little. I live in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. If y'all might be familiar with the university there, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I am a PhD student there, leaving soon with my master's. I actually study Chinese history and global history, and I'll get more into that, and I don't know, more into how that informs my actions and my practice as an organizer. Similarly to Rel, I just want to talk a little bit about the history of Chapel Hill in order to give a kind of background. Chapel Hill used to be formerly Cherokee land. Many Cherokee nations were forcibly removed from North Carolina. This is famously known as the Trail of Tears. Many thousands of Cherokee died on this forced migration from their land. The University of North Carolina was able to establish itself because it was able to buy the land very cheaply, because the Cherokee had been kicked off of it. So actually in the deeds to the land, it says that this was formerly Cherokee land that was stolen, sold cheaply to the university. And actually, in fact, there have been discoveries of remains of Cherokee people on the university's grounds. So the University of Chapel Hill was built by slaves, enslaved Black people. And basically until slavery ended in 1865, Black people were always present on campus, building the campus, working in the laundry, cooking, basically taking care of the young men who were university students. And today, many of the people who still work at the university work in housekeeping and dining and these kind of very low wage jobs that are very poorly paid and very poorly protected. Those people are descendants of the enslaved Black people who built Chapel Hill. So that's that's some of the history to show some of the complications and deepness of how far racism goes in a place like Chapel Hill, and how it just continues. It doesn't trickle down, it flows down. To get back to me a little bit, and maybe why I'm really particularly excited to be able to be present and hear everything here is I studied in China for about 2 years and was able to be in Hong Kong for like a number of weeks at a time during that time. And interestingly, obviously as an American, the ways in which when I was in Beijing, for instance, the idea that people in Hong Kong were simply Chinese, that Chinese is an ethnicity, and so simply that these people are also Chinese, and should be under the dominion of China, was an idea that was taught to us as students who are learning Chinese, but is also an idea that the American public learns and understands and thinks of when they think of China, or they think of Chinese people. So what I study kind of is that this idea of Chinese people or Black people or American people is obviously non-existent. And a lot of my experiences when I was in Beijing in Hefei really confirmed that. Obviously, the notion that China is one huge thing, that Hong Kong is a part of China, that people in Hong Kong don't have a separate understanding of themselves and culture, also supports white supremacy. And I guess I can talk more about that, but when I say that, what I mean is that the idea that this place, this landmass, and this kind of people who are in the Chinese diaspora are all the same, are all Han, is obviously untrue. That they all speak one language is obviously untrue. That they all have the same customs is obviously untrue. But this idea that everyone is the same and therefore they should all be together helps inform white supremacy in the US and helps inform the way in which we see and perceive the Chinese diaspora, the way we perceive people in East Asia, and also the way we perceive ourselves. The notion that everyone gets along in this so-called region of East Asia because everyone is of the same culture supports this idea that in America we can't get along, or that Black people will never be able to fit in because they're different, right? So this idea that East Asia, everyone is the same, but America, everyone's different. These are all lies. We know, in fact, that based on what's happening, obviously, and what's been happening in Hong Kong for years, that this is not true. So I'm so excited to talk more about those kinds of things, but my activism is at UNC Chapel Hill in 2018. A Confederate monument was toppled by a group of students and community members and workers at the university. After that, the university punished, went after, in the town, in the city of Chapel Hill, punished and went after a number of people. People were harassed by a number of surveillance organizations and by white supremacists. And so not only dealing with badged fascists, the police, the institutions, but also with unbadged fascists working in accordance. So white supremacists and police officers and the institutions all working to tell Black students and Black people at the university to be quiet. I'd be happy to talk more about my actions and all that, but in the midst of those things, a number of amazing things came out of that. One of the things that I was involved in was art around that. So the idea that monuments, maybe you all are seeing that these monuments are falling of Confederate generals or these so-called soldiers' monuments. Well, the monument at UNC was there, and what's interesting to me is, like, we're talking about George Floyd. It's so sad, and I don't want to degrade the memory of George Floyd by saying this, but every single town in America has this George Floyd. And the thing about it is that the city and the police, and I mean, often these academic institutions work together to hide that history. So we set up counter memorials to a man named James Cates, who was murdered by white supremacists at UNC in 1970. Police refused to let his cousin carry him into a car and bring him to an ambulance. So he bled out in the middle of the pit, which is kind of our quadrangle, our like kind of, spot where everyone hangs out. There's nothing to honor that. So we set up kind of counter monuments. We also worked to support people's bail and to do jail support. One of the things, I mean, I have 4 charges. I have a felony charge right now. The ways in which white supremacy often works and police works in the US is that you're killed, you're hurt, you're thrown in a police car before you go to trial, before you do anything. One of the most critical things that we learned through our movement was we need to be there for our friends to make sure that they have bail. They're not spending time in jail until they get to trial. That someone is following the police car that's taking them to the jail, that someone is making sure that there's a lawyer already set up. And I'm sure that those in Hong Kong who've been protesting also know about the kind of repression that happens extrajudicial by the police before you go to trial. Yeah. Besides that, yeah, I guess I would rather, just get into maybe like more specificity, but I'm happy to answer anything about what I'm doing or my background. Thank you for this opportunity, and thank you to the interpreters for providing translation.
Great. Thank you so much, Maya. And that was really an incredible set of remarks that it's such a unique perspective to hear that interlinkage between what is going on in terms of ideology that is perpetuated by the nation state in one area of the world, and how that upholds the ideologies of the nation state in other parts of the world, like the US. And so that is just really kind of incredible insight that we're really, really appreciative of. And hopefully we get a chance. I think there's like a hunger for it in the group chat for you to unpack that a little bit more for us. But right now we're gonna go to Tony Wong, who's editor at The Owl, for his remarks. So please take it away, Tony. Tony, do we have you here? We had Tony here a little bit earlier, so if we can just get a little bit of patience from the audience, we'll figure this out in a second.
Sorry, hi. Hi,
Okay,
can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead. Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. I'm Tony Wong, and I also prepare a PowerPoint. And so I'm Tony Wong. I'm a member of the Owl, which is a left-wing online media in Hong Kong. And I'm also a current research student of sociology. And my thesis is about the organization of logistics and support of the anti-extradition bill movement. So this presentation is a brief review of the whole movement, and I also want to talk about some of my research findings. So the protests began in last year, and two gigantic protests with 1 million and 2 million participants respectively. So actually at that time, I thought this number might be a little bit overestimated because these are just too amazing. But after that, when I look at the survey findings, which shows that 42% to 45% of the population in Hong Kong had participated in the movement. So this city have 7 million population. So according to these survey findings, around 3 million people in Hong Kong had participated in the movement. So these protest number are not overestimated. So it's really an amazing scope of mobilization. And the movement escalates very fast. And the period of militant protests sustained around half a year. And at this period, police brutality and moral mobilization from the sacrifice of frontline protesters create a major momentum of the movement. But this period ends until the police encirclement of the protesters who occupy PolyU, one of the major universities in Hong Kong. And terrible things happen both inside and outside the campus. And after that failure, the momentum of militant action is almost exhausted. If we look at the arrest number in the last year, the arrest number is already over 6,000, and until now is over 8,000, and around 40% of them are students. So because there are too many protesters getting arrested or injured, the militant action is no longer like a very viable, a viable option to guide the movement. So as Leo mentioned, the protester moved to various different tactics to sustain the movement, like the new trade union, the yellow economic circle, election, or international campaign. The varieties of tactics I think, is a key factor why this movement can sustain for so long. But I also want to talk about another key factor sustaining the movement, which is the self-organized protest network. Like in my research, I interviewed many so-called parents in this movement. Parent is the nickname of the supporter behind the young protester, because the adult protester like calling the young protester son and daughters. So during the period of radical protests, the parents provide gears to the young protester. They import high quality gears from overseas, such as 3M respirators and bulletproof materials. The parents also help the sons and daughters to retreat during dangerous situations. For example, one of the parent team I interviewed, they organized their own team of 30 voluntary drivers and built a system, a set of working procedure to rescue their sons and daughters. And these parents also provide financial assistance and shelter to the young protester, because some of the young protesters might run away from home, or they lose their job because of the movement. After the period of intense confrontation, these parents are still very, very busy, because the frontline protesters, they face many problems. Due to the violent repression, many of them had mental or physical illnesses. Some might be like arrested and charged. So these parents were like mentors who stay with the young people to see doctors or lawyers and go through the legal process. They help the sons and daughters to get back on track, to continue their study or find jobs. Under the coronavirus, my interviewees also order epidemic prevention materials such as masks, then distribute to their sons and daughters. So parent is just one example. What I find in my study is that many protesters across various social backgrounds create long-lasting bonding with each other. And these informal networks are working on different aspects and providing a robust social base to the movement. So this is the right side of movement. But however, I don't want to like beautify the movement as if it has no problem, and it's not. There are many. So I want to talk about a tendency that I worry so much, and I feel very embarrassed to talk about this. There are many Trump supporters in the Hong Kong protests, and recently some right-wing writers spread negative views on Black Lives Matter on Apple Daily. Apple Daily is the only mass media with a clear stand to support the movement. These right-wing writers repeat some of the conservative rumors, like Black Lives Matter is organized by Antifa, and they emphasize looting. They criticize the so-called political correctness. And also on LinkedIn, a discussion forum, which is a major online platform of the protest, is also full of similar views. So why do they hold such views? I think there are three key reasons. First, I think these people wrongly believe that the representative democracy is the perfect institution. So people in a democratic country should protest peacefully. And second, and they believe Trump is the only political leader of the United States who has the determination to fight against China, so they need to support Trump. But I think these Trump supporters, they discriminate against migrants from mainland China to Hong Kong. So they also had very conservative views on racism and immigration issues in general. So, of course, several writers and a discussion forum cannot represent millions of participants in this movement, but unfortunately, the right wing does have a larger voice in the Hong Kong protest, at least in the online media. But there are some people writing articles to fight back, including like my own media group, but our voice are weak. And I hope that in the future, a more reasonable voice can be heard in Hong Kong, and more Hong Kong protesters will stand with the protesters in the United States. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Tony. And thank you for really flagging what is some very kind of difficult and problematic kind of political formations within a very kind of broad Hong Kong pro-democracy movement. And these are, you know, the kind of elements that are most deleterious to ability of Hong Kong folks to take that first step in standing in solidarity with Black liberation movements. And it takes a lot of courage and difficult discussion in order to kind of flag that and think about ways in which we can address those issues. So thank you so much for your courage in bringing that up. So now that everybody, all four of our speakers have been had an opportunity to discuss some of their views and thoughts, I think this is the time that we're going to open it up to the audience for Q&A. There are a lot of participants here, so we're going to have, I'm sure, a lot of questions. My apologies if we're not able to get to all of them, but we'll do our best. And we've still got, a good, 25, let's say 25 to 30 minutes of audience Q&A at least. So let's open it up to the floor. And we already had a couple of questions, I think, at the very beginning, earlier on. And then so, a couple of them are kind of directed, I think, at Maya and to maybe have a little bit more room for you to discuss how the monolithic view of Chinese identity upholds white supremacy. So if Maya or anybody else might have some thoughts on that, we'll open it up there.
Oh yeah. So sorry. I think I was like not explaining that as fully as I could have. I think Tony just explained something that was very important, that people in Hong Kong who are more likely to sympathize with Trump and be racist towards Black people are prejudiced towards mainlanders. I'm trying to think of how to use a really good example to explain this. Basically, I think that in the way in which China is personified is obviously also an image that's from white supremacy. Like the way in which Xi Jinping talks about China and President Trump talks about China is not that different. The way in which a white nationalist talks about China and the way in which Xi Jinping talks about China is not very dissimilar. And the reason why is because they both want to preserve the Chinese empire. And what would it mean to acknowledge that China is an empire, right? I don't think that when we talk about, a lot of people in the American left, for instance, don't acknowledge that. And that is also racialist. And I think it's to assume that people who, I guess in my studies, I would say are Han, represent all of China, and that the identity of Han has always existed forever, which it hasn't. I mean, if we look at kind of studies or history, we find that this identity becomes more important in order to oppose the Manchu Qing Empire and to reform a Chinese nation that included many places that don't perceive themselves as Chinese, such as Uyghurs in Xinjiang and Tibetans, but also people in Hong Kong and people in Taiwan, and even people in mainland China. I think the idea also that supports white supremacy is the idea that everyone in mainland China gets along and is fine, and everything would be fine if just HK in mainland China broke apart. I think a lot of people would argue that mainland China as an empire has to also break apart, similarly to the US. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that imperialists in the US, people who agree that the US should stay as it is, people who disagree with Black Lives Matter, who agree that the US was conquered supposedly, and that would disagree with the indigenous genocide, also support the idea that China, as people perceive it, the Chinese empire, has always existed forever. And everyone there is the same and believes in the same thing. So I think for talking, when Tony brought up also these Trump supporters, these aren't people who are necessarily, and I think it's important that Tony brought up, these aren't allies to necessarily deforming the Chinese empire in the same way that people who, would claim that Black people and Black Lives Matter aren't helpful to the US struggle against police violence. I'm not sure if I explain that as clearly as I could have, but that's my answer to how the idea that all of China is the same, that this region in East Asia should all stay together, that there's no rebellions going on inside mainland China, but also everywhere in this region, supports the idea that in America, Black liberation isn't important, that the Native genocide wasn't important too.
Thanks, Maya. Does anybody else on the panel want to jump in on this question? Okay, if not, then I'll move on to another question from the Q&A. And just a reminder that this video is being recorded, so we'll have ability to kind of revisit a lot of the amazing conversation that is happening here today. A question about how do we integrate class issues, right, and economic justice into movements, and in particular, I think they're talking about the Hong Kong movement, after the right wing has done such a significant job in co-opting a lot of these issues and imbuing it with those kind of values. So what is kind of like the tension between some of the leftist ideas of socioeconomic justice with some of the nativist ideas that are happening in Hong Kong kind of yellow circles right now? Maybe if Leo or Tony wants to take a crack at that.
It's very. I think yes. I think I can maybe give an overall response. Yeah. I do agree that currently in Hong Kong, although most of the Hong Kong protesters go, encounter police violence in daily basis. But many of the Hongkongers do not really have the right information, or they even spread fake news on the current American struggles. Yeah, I think in a way it shows that we are not doing enough. Yeah, but on the other hand, I think the current, and that's also somehow in Hong Kong, it's so obvious that so-called making use of the conflict between the U.S. and China has become somehow a strong strategy for international lobbying. For this part, I think still among the movement that there is still debates whether this is very useful or not. And I think even though those who call for such international pressure, and those who call for U.S. pressure, deep down to their mind, they also knows that international politics are based on benefit. So in a way, I think the situation shows that up to now, 1 year of struggle, why would people focus very much on the conflict between China and US and hoping Trump can save, is only a reflection that somehow there's too much difficulty to move further. Yeah, what I mean is people are still trying different way. Yeah, but this is in some way the most attractive one. Yeah, so it create the result. It seems like this is the only call up to now at this stage. But I think that's not really true if we look at on the ground. Is that actually many protesters are trying very hard to mobilize on the street. Although, with such police brutality, and many of them actually do not trust that revolution can be done overseas. Yeah. But of course, with the sentiment that with the solidarity sentiment, they will not criticize much on that side. Yeah. On the other hand, okay, so how to integrate class issue into mass movement like the Hong Kong political one? I think first of all, we cannot, in Hong Kong context at least, is that it's very hard to distinguish the Hong Kong people, their left wing or their right wing. But I would agree that overall, as a very, as a capitalized city, in most of the people, the major value is very, somehow believing free market, something like that. But at the same time, what we see is when these people get into the union organizing, they also have direct imagination that they should concern the labor rights. And I think there is a logic behind their generation, because nowadays those unions, the new organizers are aged between like 25 to 35, which is the generation that grow with new liberalism. And for this generation, they have no hope to so-called climb the economic ladder. Yeah. So and they have more concern on whether their life is have work-life balance. You may not you couldn't imagine, in Hong Kong, there's no regulation on working hours. So these people automatically, they have the concern on such class issue, but they do not recognize this is a class issue. This is, issue that they concern, so as the political issue. Yeah, but just where they find a way out, so when they find a way out as a unionist, they try to tackle it with the employers, and that is happening. So that's where I say the new union movement, in a way, reshake the demands. They didn't put it at the 6 demands, but they already reshake the subjectivity as a Hong Kongers. So I think
I wonder if it's possible, sorry, we don't have a ton of time, so I just wanted to be to extend also that question to Jarrell and Maya of, how would you want to see labor unions be part of or support the movement, and just so we get both sides from Hong Kong and the U.S.
Yeah, do you mind if I speak to that a little? Thank you. It's been such great things I'm hearing, y'all. I think in the United States, it's interesting because, like I mentioned before, there's so many intersections, and we live in a culture of racialized capitalism. And so oftentimes, especially in the media, the racial element is going to be overemphasized and emphasized as well it should be as a history of the United States. But definitely understanding the class elements of capitalism and how that creates a divide. It's often probably one of the most underspoken topics politically when it comes to the United States. And I think that labor is definitely a very important point. The means of production, those who are manipulated by the economic oppression of capitalism, those voices are often erased. The conversations around labor, the conversations around class are often very ableist and very inaccessible, where we're talking about language as well. And so I think one way to really continue, I think that's the point of escalation when it comes to any kind of regional or localized movement, is creating that class analysis around whether we're talking about police brutality. It's specifically, that's a class issue as well as a racial issue. When we're talking about unemployment, that's a racial issue as well as a class issue. And I know in the city that I live in Seattle, there's a huge population of folks who are houseless and homeless. And those voices are often very erased and not a part of the conversation when it comes to creating a class analysis in that movement. And so I think really trying to unpack the isms, especially when it comes to racism and capitalism, because the media conversations will always usually center and at the forefront, and maybe even very correctly so, sometimes center the racial element. However, there will be very limited conversations around the economic element. And so even as we think about right now, the news will talk about quote unquote looters, and not seeing this as economic repression, not seeing it as a response to being oppressed and under the thumb of a violent economic oppressor, and then seeing police brutality not as these standalone incidences. Oh, it happened in Texas, it happened in Chicago, oh, it happened in Seattle, but to see the police as the enforcement arm of the government's racialized, capitalized oppression, I think is very important. And that's actually a point of escalation when it comes to developing analysis and how movements are able to be intersected, because whether we're talking about immigrants in the United States, whether we're talking about women of color, whether we're talking about young people, the class element is probably one of the most important unspoken conversations. So thank y'all for elevating that.
Thank you, Jarrell. I'm cognizant of time. We got maybe 10 more minutes, so I wanted to load up another question, which is, can comrades in Seattle and North Carolina speak about the autonomous zones that are being kind of created in those areas, And I know a lot of people were thinking, especially from the Hong Kong, coming from the Hong Kong movement, this looks a little bit like that 79-day 2014 Occupy movement that happened under the umbrella revolution. Of course, it's extremely different, but people are just wanting to know more about kind of what's happening and why it's happening.
Well, they haven't set up. Well, they haven't set up like a technical, like the Chaz in North Carolina. There was actually in 2011, a number of people did set up took over and occupied something, a building, a grocery kind of store during Occupy Wall Street. And they set up community gardens and a number of other things. And then they were eventually driven out by police with assault rifles. And the same police chief who did that has now taken racial equity training and is considered an ally. So I think, and so in talking about autonomous zones, and I say that with all hope that doesn't happen to the Chaz, and because the people doing that have learned so much from so many other things happening. But what I'm talking about is maybe that every place has to be an autonomous zone, even if you don't have physical space. Because physical space, and again, I think we can relate to this in terms of maybe thinking of Chinese Empire and American Empire both as settler colonies. Space has so often been enforced with bullets and tear gas and pepper spray. And so many times our bodies have been put on the line for just a little bit of space. So how do we create autonomy wherever we go? Is a question that I think a lot of us have explored in Chapel Hill. And how do we keep moving regardless of where cops want us to go? And so I think in terms of creating that kind of space, of creating an autonomous zone everywhere, I mean, and also talking about white supremacy is not just setting up a space where only people who are able to physically run away, who are able to physically defend themselves, can exist in that space. That means if you are someone who, is a white American, has space, you should open it up to people of color. You should open it up to people who are poor. You should allow them to have space instead of, just creating it out of government spaces, because we know in America that those are hard to maintain. Whereas white supremacy exists in the home. White supremacy, exists in suburbs which are never occupied. White supremacy exists in our parks. It exists in our hospitals. It exists in every single space in America. So to me, and I'm like interested in hearing from everyone, especially Rel, because of like your experiences in Seattle and what you're doing, like how do we set up an autonomous space everywhere, and with the intention that we're going to protect everyone in it, not just those who can happen to exist, who can take tear gas, for instance, who can run.
Maya, I just love listening to you. I just want to say that. I appreciate everything. Well, I also want to just pay respects to the fact that there's been a number of bodies, and not bodies, but a number of humans, groups, and energies that have created what is being now known as the Chaz. And personally, I'm not one of those people that have been organizing that specific space. And so I just want to pay respects to the folks that have put in that energy over the last 8 to 9 days in the Capitol Hill area. And I think that it's a really, I wonder if people know what autonomy means sometimes, because I think about autonomy as self-determination of ability to create the space within your own self-determining energy without impediment. And there's so many different energies that are going into the Chaz. And I think that one of the things that is exciting that I've seen is the amount of just community care. What happens when community wants to take care of each other. And it's not those aren't the stories that are being propagated in the media. The fact that there are so many groups and volunteers, people lending their skills and talents, whether we're talking about community medics, whether we're talking about people bringing water, whether we're talking about artists popping up and blessing the space with the culture of art, I think is really important to the energy that we're seeing in Chaz. I think the media's role is probably always detrimental to an extent because it's going to be framed in a certain perspective. There's going to be certain perspectives that are going to be lifted up and will be the topic of conversation, regardless of whether anyone out here gives a shit what Trump says. If Trump tweets about it, now that's the contextual example of this space, which I think is unfortunate because, like I said, there's been so many people that have been present. I'm talking 24/7 over the last 10 days in that space. And again, I'm saying I'm not one of those people that have been present in that particular space. But I think one thing that's interesting when we think about autonomous zones and autonomous spaces is what that means in a space that is already settler colonial. And so what does it look like for us as folks that are wanting to create autonomous spaces? How do we not perpetuate the settler colonial practices of, well, we're just going to claim this space for, or in the name of, you know what I'm saying? And I think that those conversations, if that culture and conversation isn't created, then the natural instinct will naturally be settler colonial, and we'll lay claim to spaces that maybe we could pay better respect to the cultural history of it. For example, the area that that Chaz is in, and I think it's called Chaz. The area that the Chaz is in is a historic, over the last a long time now, it's a very safe place for LGBTQ folks. But I don't necessarily see the trans community at the forefront of the determination of what the area is about. You see, some folks have to bring the culture to the space to ensure that the culture is represented. And so there's so many layers. I think it's a great example of what can happen when folks really do come together. I think that there are definitely difficult conversations when it comes to the autonomous zones. But in order for liberation to exist, freedom is autonomy in perpetuity. Autonomy for 10 days, autonomy for 15 days is an example to look to, but it's not liberation. And I think the conversations of community care, how is that sustained? What happens when conflict arises? How do we ensure that everyone is fed? Maya's points around ableism. How do we ensure that this is an accessible place? What happens if everybody can't physically run? What if people can't hear the flashbangs or hear, you know what I'm saying, or see what's going on? Ensuring that these places are going to be safe for all, without exception, I think doesn't just happen naturally. It takes the intentionality of organization. And to be honest, just like care, I want to say love. I don't want to front, like love sustains shit, especially when it comes to community. And so I would just shout out the organizers and people that have been on the ground every day in Chaz. And I feel like there's going to be other spaces. And to be honest, I think there probably are other autonomous places in the United States. I think it's being framed as like an anomaly. But when I've gone down to Oakland on first Friday of the month, it feels like that's an autonomous zone too. And so I think we'll see more and more examples as time goes on. Appreciate the questions and the answers out here.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. This is amazing kind of discussion. And I know we're at our time limit now, but I was wondering if the panelists might be interested in maybe extending another 15, 20 minutes. So maybe we can get one or two more questions in. Is that okay with folks? All right. All right. So the next question is more targeted towards Hong Kong organizers, but we're talking about racial justice. We're talking about migrant justice. So can you talk a little bit about how Southeast Asian, and in particular migrant workers, are being addressed or not addressed by the movement? And how are they being supported to unionize or organize and gain more worker rights? But also opening it up to Maya and Jarrell and thinking about how migrant justice is tied into these movements.
Yeah, in fact, in Hong Kong, the migrants domestic worker movement is very strong. That's why they have a strong networks, and they have their own unions as well. Basically based on their own nationality. They organize by nationality, and for the unions, they also join, as affiliation in Hong Kong CTU. So we have, on one hand, we have particular program with them for, targeting the unfair agency practice, excessive agency fee. On the other hand, we do have campaign against human trafficking, mostly work together with the migrant workers. For this movement is much more complicated. Yeah. On one hand, we found that interestingly, not many migrants are against this protest, especially on the other hand, we found many Indonesian and Filipinos who really support the Hong Kong struggle, which in a way, we still not yet totally know why. And I think one of the important background is there is already an existing strong network among the migrant movement in Hong Kong, and they have strong connection with the local civil society. So they can quickly know what happened. But on the other hand, is they also found very hard to join into the movement, as per the movement being more militant and more and more political. There are domestic workers who became voluntary reporters on the street every Sunday, and at the end, she were arrested, and the immigration in Hong Kong made use of their power, excessive power, to detain her without any reason. Just visa problem, just like everywhere. Yeah. So, and then she was deployed. So at that time, several, a group of activists also tried to bring out this issue. She was detained in the CIC, a detention center, particularly for the migrants, or so-called illegal migrants. And in that center, the treatment is even worse than jail. Yeah. So we all tried. There's a group of local activists. Organize an assembly to stand with her and address the problem of such immigration issue. And Tony is also one of the organizers. So I think honestly, there's very slim chance for such a wide movement to address in the daily basis the migrants issue in a way. But on the other hand, many protester activists is trying very hard to try do something, and we can find that actually people does have a concern when you try to do this, and many self-organized energy would create the solidarity during the assembly, and communicate with that migrant workers. Yeah, so that's one example. Yeah.
Tony, do you have any thoughts on this as well, like the especially the Southeast Asian migrant workers and the relationships with the movement and how they're supported or not supported?
I think in general this movement. So how to say? So some people talk about this how to connect this movement to the minority group, but I think in general, in this aspect, we have very little progress. Like the event of Yuli actually only attract maybe 200 people. It is just a very, very small scale assembly, and so many people know each other. So and also people talk about connecting with the South Asia minority for a while, but it doesn't really sustain because. But overall, I think the objective of this or the demands of this movement is not related to the equality or that kind of migration issue. So I think we can only accept that.
Yeah, thank you for your comments on some of the limitations really of then the Hong Kong movement in terms of not having that structural kind of anti-racist lens, right? And that's perhaps like a course correction that the people here in this chat can really start thinking about. How to imbue the movement with a racial justice values, how to imbue it with a work to address kind of anti-Blackness within Hong Kong, within Chinese kind of communities. And one more, we're going to do one more question, and I open it up to kind of everyone. This is a little bit of the wrap-up question. But what are some of the underlying shared values that are prominent among Hong Kong protesters and their supporters, and that we can connect to when dialoguing with protesters from the US to build solidarity with Black liberation movements? And maybe like vice versa, that same kind of question for Jarrell and Maya, right? What are these kind of shared values and how do we engage each other? And I open it up to anybody who wants to address that first.
Can I say something? Cool. Can you hear me? Okay, I'm just making sure. My laptop's super wonky sometimes. I was gonna say that I really think going back to literally the idea of the experience of people in the HK protests, also in the way in which media talks about it, the way in which European media rhetoricizes it, the way in which when you talk about HK protests, someone, for instance, who opposes them in the West can bring up an image of a Westerner and say, this person represents that. Well, this is like the unique experience of colonialism, right? And dealing with like the way in which your movement's always going to be narrativized, I think. So, you know, what you hear about HK protesters, you know, despite the fact that there are images and videos exist of people having their heads bashed, I'm sorry to be graphic, being tear gassed also. I mean, in Raleigh, similarly to HK, there might have been an instance of expired tear gas being used, which converts into cyanide. People being broken and beaten, and also being told that that's not happening and it's not true, and that they're exaggerating it, and that they should just kind of submit to the empire, which knows better. than they do. I think that is a common experience that both Black Lives Matter and Black liberation organizers and the HK liberation organizers understand, being just dismissed and constantly having that denied. And so informing in that experience, I mean, you become suspicious of media and you become more reliant on networks of people in front of you and around you. And I think those are two strategies that we both also share. So I don't know. Those are things that I think in going forward, we can't ignore in the commonalities, regardless if people want to say about the CCP. I mean, it's terrible and it's evil, the way in which the HK liberation protesters and the way in which Black liberation protesters are being discussed by the empire and by white Western media is similar. Except for ones who are waving Trump flags. But those are not also the people who are having their heads bashed in or getting tear gassed, if we think about it, you know?
So, although I said there are many Trump supporters in Hong Kong, and I hate them so much, but I also agree that the police brutality, the experience can provide like an opportunity to connect the protester of the two places. And before the movement, Hong Kong people are so apolitical. So if the Black Lives Matter movement happened in 2 years ago, and I don't think there are a lot Hong Kong people will concerned the protests in other countries, but at least now they are debating about the protests in America and how they should take a stand on this issue. And this also gave us an opportunity to talk about all the issue about racism, about colonialism, about all kind of inequality. So that is can also be an opportunity. That's what I want to say.
Jarrell or Leo, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I think y'all did a great job of explaining that. I think some of the shared values are, I mean, definitely acknowledging that something is wrong and that people are fed up. I think that that's definitely a rallying point for solidarity. When you're tired of something, there's just the energy of we're fed up and this can't go on. I think that energy and it's ripe, as well as, you know, caring about each other. I think that that's a value when it comes to sustained movements. We have to be with each other. We have to care for each other. Yeah, you know, there's folks that'll say, you know, revolutionaries, or you can tell a revolutionary by how they struggle for their people. And I'm sure for any folks that have been on front lines, the people that you've been on front lines with, there are strong bonds to struggle with somebody, to be tear gas, to have to run from cops, or you know, potentially even be incarcerated with folks is a uniting factor. And so just really caring about each other, that is what will sustain the movement. And I think also acknowledging what needs to be different in order for the movements right now to be divergent from those of history. I think that the civil rights movement of the 1960s was limited by its emphasis on being civil rights as opposed to human rights. So I think that there is a growing understanding of the need to internationalize our movements and to understand that when we're talking about economic liberation in the United States, that's absolutely connected to the labor movements in the factories in China. And that's also connected to neocolonialism on the continent of Africa right now. And so just understanding, I think, those points as we move forward, you know, Sankofa looking back so that we can move forward in a new direction. And I just want to say shout out to the youth, because the folks under 24 and under right now are really giving a brand new energy and lifeblood globally. The youth right now are the truth right now is absolutely a chant that we continually do all the time, because they really are bringing a new analysis. And I think us as, and I'm calling us elders, us as yelders and elders, really supporting and elevating the platform of the youth right now globally. That's the move. That is absolutely the move. I'm really appreciative of all the wisdom and knowledge. My notebooks are filled with notes. Thank y'all.
Yeah, I think in a way, I would like to say, like, somehow maybe in such a desperate period in Hong Kong, the international lobbying work is too much, you know, focused on the high level of international dialogue, that people would seldom think about the international solidarity among the civil society level. And that's where we have to do more. And I appreciate a lot Lausan and to organize this. And I think in Hong Kong, the question is not really that people are in the right wing or in the left wing, but how in what scenario they got the right information or the empathy to express. For example, in the last year, when the student protests in Jakarta, all over the Indonesia, in fact, the protesters, when they saw the picture that those protesters get tear gas and the water cannon attack, they have strong empathy. They actually, in Hong Kong, people never concerned about Southeast Asia. Where is it? The imagination of Indonesia maybe is only Bali or Jakarta. But looking at one particular protest, I think it's the first time. And that is because of the painful experience they got on the street in Hong Kong. So I think I'm not that pessimistic that Hong Kongers do not have empathy with the Black Lives Matters movement in America. Instead, I think this is the only stage that Hong Kong people have the higher intention and potential to connect with that movement. But of course, getting such a widespread fake news here in Hong Kong, we gotta do more. I agree, yeah. But I think I'm not that pessimistic, honestly. Yeah.
Great. I mean, that was such a powerful kind of conversation, and thank you for pulling together all the strands of our discussion here today, and ways we can think about just the necessity of kind of internationalizing struggles. It's not just the Hong Kong and U.S. struggle, and there's so many things, mass movements happening around the world. Particularly, before COVID, there might have been a good 24 kind of mass struggles. And Jarrell, what you're talking about, where people are fed up, and the youth is the truth. And so I just want to so thankful and appreciative for the four of you to come here today and to share your experience, engage in dialogue with us. This was such an important and timely conversation. In terms of wrapping up, I'll just say that this webinar will be kind of captured somehow. We'll have discussions with the panelists and the organizers about which way is the best way to do that, whether it's like transcripts or like a blog post recap or like releasing the recording. We'll have a discussion about that, but it will be captured and disseminated. And yeah, just thank you so much to the panelists. Thank you, huge thank you to the interpreters who have been working ridiculously hard, a really hard job to capture this. Thank you so much, and the people and the organizers from, and then thank all of you, the audience and participants, for joining in, and that's it. So you know, hope y'all stay safe and healthy, and see you, yeah, on the next thing. Keep fighting. Thank you.